Background noise, gotta love it. Anyway. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Forrest over here, and welcome back to another live stream. Today we are going to continue reading, like I said earlier, taking a little break, then we're going to do this. Reading Slobberknocker, My Life is in Wrestling by good old JR Jim Ross. This is, as you can tell from the title, this is part 5. We're going to be delving into 2 parts of the book, since they are very small parts compared to the rest of the books here. We're going to be reading through 2 parts. We have Part 3, UWF, 1986 to 87. There are 2 chapters for that part. And then Part 4, Crockett, 1987 to 88, which consists of 4 chapters. 4 short chapters. So, without further ado, let's begin. Part 3, UWF, 1986 to 87. Chapter 21, The Expansion, 1986. I want to put you with Michael so we get more of a yin and a yang, Cowboy said. At that time, Jesse Ventura was catching fire as a heel commentator on WWF TV alongside Vince McMahon. Michael was going to bring out the heel perspective that the audience mightn't want to hear, but is true. I nodded along. Whatever the plan was, I was all in, as usual. The Michael Cowboy was talking about was Michael P.S. Hayes, 1/3 of the notorious Fabulous Freebirds. Watts never usually considered using an active talent on commentary, but he knew how good Michael was at catching people's attention with his mouth. And, quite frankly, the Freebirds were a better in-ring team were a better in-ring team with Buddy and Terry, with Michael's forte really being on Mike. You ready to rock? Hayes asked me in his great... He's like, you ready? How am I gonna do this? It's gonna suck. I gotta think like Paul Heyman did. If you want someone to do a true promo on you, bow you over there and rip your asshole yay fucking wide. Yeah, I remember that story that Paul Heyman talked about. That is a reference toward a story Paul Heyman said on the channel Inside the Ropes regarding the promo that he did on Vince McMahon in the build-up to the 2001 Survivor Series, which was at the time involving the storyline regarding the invasion, which is regarded as one of, if not the worst, WWE storylines of all time, even during their days as WWF, which it was at the time. It was the World Wrestling Federation at the time. Yeah, that's a reference to a backstage thing that Michael Hayes did to Vince McMahon in regard to Paul. And Paul, in case you're wondering, what does Paul E mean? When he was before he became the owner of ECW, Paul Heyman went under the ring name of Paul E. Dangerously, which is not the best name which is probably a cheesy name. But let's not forget, we're talking about a man who is well known under the managerial name of Paul Bearer, was once known as Percy Pringle. Okay, let's not forget about that. Part of me feels like Pringles. It was either he was inspired. His name was inspired by the name of the Pringles chip, or Pringles the company was inspired by his name, Percy Pringle, and so that's why they made him that way. I don't know. I don't know the whole story there. Yeah, I don't know which came first. Percy Pringle, the manager, or Pringle, the chip company. Anyway, yeah, we're moving on. You ready to rock? Hayes asked me in his gravel-toned voice as we waited to go on air. I was indeed ready to rock. You take the nuts and bolts of this deal, he said, and I'll do what I was put here to do. Put on this earth to do, or at this desk to do? I asked. Both, Jim, he replied as the show began. Both. Our newly named Universal Wrestling Federation was being syndicated nationally and receiving a reputation as the best wrestling show in the country. Watts' plan to rival WWF was simple in its execution. We put on a great by God wrestling show, he said. Now that I could understand. We had the roster to do it too. Dr. Death Steve Williams, One Man Gang, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, along with the beautiful Missy Hyatt, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Bill Irwin, The Fantastics, Ted DiBiase, Chris Adams, Terry Taylor, Rick Steiner, The Fabulous Freebirds, and Sting, among others. I'm not gonna try to tell you about each and every wrestler, but this was in the 1980s. A number of these wrestlers would go on to have careers in the 90s, some in the 2000s, others, particularly one that I can think of right here, aka Sting, going as far as the 2010s and up until recently, and then the 2020s until it was either late last year or early this year when he had his last match and then retired. We continue to run shows in our strongholds like Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, but also traveled out around, including out west, in correlation with Watts' national expansion. At one time, we actually used the Southwest Airlines routing map to build our expansion. Looking at Michael, I could tell he liked the gig. He was smart enough to know that the more hats he wore, the more valuable he was to anyone who wanted to hire him. He had a creative mind when the company could see right away. He was personable and entertaining, but sometimes a pain in the ass, especially with booking ideas. But if he was supposed to be at a booking meeting and he missed it, Bill didn't wait on him. The meeting started and ended on Cowboy's time. But Michael was a free bird in and out of the ring. It wasn't his character, it was his mentality, his way of thinking. That's why he, Buddy, and Terry were so good. They weren't playing the roles of renegade Southern rockers. They were exactly that. Michael's mix of unpredictability meshed well with my sports-like approach. I was a regular at the booking and TV meetings now and knew precisely the direction that Bill wanted us to go in, the way he wanted his roster spoken about. Cowboy had definite ideas as to how to describe a heel and to describe a babyface. Adjectives, descriptors. Baby faces are not stupid, he'd say over and over again. There are no redeeming social qualities in a heel. I don't want to hear that the heel is a family man. I don't want people to like the son of a bitch in any shape or fashion. There was 42 minutes of content, and Cowboy wanted every segment to have meaning. He hated throwaway minutes. Everything had to have significance in some shape, form, or fashion. You know, you know what stiffed me what stiffed me on the Superdome payoff, Michael whispered to me across the table just before showtime. I did know. Everyone knew. Not that Watts did or didn't underpay him, but that Michael sure felt like Watts did. Hayes' heel approach was pushed the right buttons in me, because just like he was a freebird, I was always me out there too. I'd take it personally for that 42 minutes, because I wanted to come across to viewers that I was damn sure pissed off, or concerned, or fearful for a wrestler's safety or welfare, his livelihood. And I wanted to sound real because to me it was real. It had been drilled into my mind that you called everything like it was a real sporting event. That's how I learned. That's how I was programmed. Michael, being an old school guy, had the same mindset. On TV, the bad guys were dirty, no good, antagonistic bastards. Just like how I felt off camera. I was starting to feel down, like I was heading into a dark place. I knew I should have said it to someone, but that wasn't the way men were taught to deal with their thoughts. I swore to myself that after the store failed that I would never ever find myself in that position of failure again. I would never let my folks down, my family down again. I would work all hours, day and night, to make sure that I wasn't a write-off 2 times in my life. But that drive and obsession dragged me into a ditch. Instead of talking to a professional to get some help, I went to see a bartender. I was drinking, smoking, working, sleeping a little, and repeating the process over and over again. I believed 100% of what we were doing. I saw Watts work I saw Watts work even harder than me. I saw the crowd reactions and the ratings come in. We were doing monster numbers on our TV show. It was working. All the work was coming back to us in the form of happy TV programmers and more interested syndication opportunities. We were now on 120 local channels across the USA and growing nationally. All of this was happening. All of what I thought would make me happy was coming together, but none of it made me feel better. None of it was helping to drag me back out of the dark spot I found myself in. All the work did was give me a little time to forget just how badly I thought of myself in my own head. As I looked across at Cowboy Bill Watts, I could see fleeting signs that he must have been going through the same. Take that drink real quick. I always gotta take a drink in between chapters. That tea is such good. Anyway, Chapter 22, The Decline and Sale, 1987. The oil industry collapsed, taking down our core cities with it. Bill was counting on those towns to carry the UWF while he built the new markets with our nationwide expansion. Around the heartland of what was called Mid-South Wrestling, there was a real recession going on. Businesses were closing, people were losing their houses. Even Southern Nazarene University and Oklahoma City University almost went under. Expanding nationally was the right idea, at the wrong time in the economy. Buying wrestling tickets just wasn't at the front of people's thoughts. They were more worried about how they were going to pay their bills and buy groceries. Cowboy was worried about the same thing. It's not like he forgot how to hook or forget the fundamentals that kept the company strong. Our TV ratings were stronger than an acre of garlic right to the end. The UWF didn't lose even one station because of ratings. People still had the emotional investment in that brand, but they could fill this void by watching it on TV. The shows were packaged with the Memphis World Class and AWA promotions, along with Joe Pedicino's Pro Wrestling This Week show and national syndication with advertisers such as Selsun Blue and Esper Cream buying the package. However, Bill couldn't hold out financially any longer. He began to lose top stars such as Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Teddy DiBiase to WWF, and his word was coming back that Watts' former star JYD had his own action figure, and that pulled in $150,000 annually, or so we were told. Bill, I said, I've got an idea. Cowboy was listening. He was burnt out and ready to hear other suggestions. Why don't you sell? I said. I could ask Crockett if he was interested in buying. I didn't know if Watts was going to hug me or kill me for even bringing the suggestion up. $2 million, he said. Excuse me? Excuse me? I heard him, but was taken by surprise at just how quickly and easily he essentially said yes to selling his company. You get us $2 million, and I'm out. I was making more money than I ever had in my life, but I was living at the Quality Inn in Glenpool, Oklahoma, now estranged from my second wife. I was pretty much just existing as a human being, but as a wrestling guy, I knew this was the biggest day of my career. Cowboy asked me to handle some business, to see if there was a way for his company and Crockett's to do some joint ventures. But really, that was the only to get me in the door. I was going to sell the company. Crockett was gearing up for his biggest run at McMahon, and on paper, Crockett seemed to have a better shot at competing with WWF than Watts did. Cowboy went deep into debt organizing his national television syndication affiliates. He over-leveraged by signing wrestlers to exclusive contracts and was losing up to $50,000 a week. More importantly, his passion for the business was leaving him rapidly. I knew what my play was. I could see what was coming over the horizon, and I knew how best to shift gears to not only survive the oncoming realities, but to make sure everyone benefited. I came in as a gopher, taking notes and buying cigars and whiskey for Leroy. Now I found myself on a private jet, just me and the pilot, as I made my way to Millionaire Hangar in Atlanta. While in the air, I thought of Bill the day before. Cowboy looked tired, almost melancholy. His words were of a man who was still willing to fight, but I knew him long enough to know that his heart was no longer in it. When I landed in Atlanta, Crockett and his right-hand man, Rob Garner, were waiting for me in the conference room at the terminal. There was no food ordered, no drinks had. It was just straight business. Neither Crockett nor Watts was setting the world on fire with their promotions, and I spent 20 minutes talking to Crockett and Garner about how both companies should come together if they wanted to continue to challenge Vince. In truth, I was trying to read the room and see just how big Crockett's appetite was for continuing to compete with McMahon. "'Cause you know," I said as the meeting was coming to a close, "if you weren't willing to team up, then Watts might think of selling." I could see on both men's faces that this news was of huge curiosity to them, not solely because they might have been interested in buying, but that they knew McMahon would be. "Now, the way I see it," I continued, "is that if you were to buy Watts out, you could have yourself a Super Bowl, except you'd own both teams." Crockett's face wasn't telling me much. I didn't know if he was interested or not, but I was in now, so decided to keep going. "You keep your show on TBS and you put UWF on there too. Have your NWA guys win an equal amount and your UWF guys here with so pitting one league against the other." "How much?" Crockett replied. "I expect McMahon will have interest, but we're coming to you first," I said, ignoring his question. Excuse me. "How much?" Crockett asked again. Bill's $2 million price tag was on the tip of my tongue. $4 million, I said. He was supposed to say $2 million, and this man said $4 million. I don't know if that's a scam or if he's just playing it, or if he just thought, "Oh my God, I can't believe I did something this crazy." Who knows how Bill's gonna react to that if it comes to it. If he even talks about Bill Watts' reaction to it. Crockett nodded. "My personal split was going to be 5% of the overall sales price." I brought up the number to give me some room to negotiate. Oh, that would explain it, yeah. I could see Crockett wanted UWF. He wanted to double his efforts to compete with Vince, and Watts had a 120 individual TV contracts that would hugely help in that regard. My percentage of a deal would give me room to plan my own next move. I wanted to go home, but I had nothing to go home to. "Tell Bill to call me," Crockett said, and he and Garner left the room. After they had left, I waited a respectable amount of time to make sure both men were gone before calling Bill from a payphone. This time I had a calling card and didn't have to call collect his Gene Kaniski. This was twice what he asked for. And just as importantly to a stubborn, prideful man like Cowboy, this was a respectable way out of the wrestling business. He wouldn't be seen as beaten. He would be seen as someone who sold his company at a price he couldn't walk away from. Bill, I said as Cowboy answered the phone. And in the middle of an airport terminal in Atlanta, I told the man who brought me into the wrestling business that I had just sold the company which started my career. Part 4. Crockett, 1987 to 88. Chapter 23. Crockett, 1987. Watts finalized the details of selling his company. Jim Crockett Jr. would buy the Universal Wrestling Federation in a deal that promised both companies would be run like two separate leagues under the same organization. Both brands would be kept separate, with distinct rosters and championships. I decided to keep going in the business too, but my role would now be of just an announcer. Crockett already had people to run his promotion, advertising, and live event divisions. And he had the larger than life Dusty Rhodes booking his shows. He assumed the office space that Watts had decided on in Dallas for his national expansion, and Garner, J.J. Dillon, Dusty, and others followed Jimmy to buy homes and live that Dallas lifestyle. I packed up my dark blue two-door Lincoln Continental and drove myself and everything I owned to Dallas as well. For the first time in my professional wrestling career, I was going to be solely an on-air talent, and I could feel the pressure of trying to be all things to all people slowly lift from my shoulders. As I walked around the new dressing room, I could see that it was more or less the same as all the dressing rooms I'd seen before. There was smoke and ribbon, people telling stories, others catching up on the sleep. There were card games and jostling, hangovers and ball breaking. Professional wrestling behind the curtain was like a sophomore locker room for oversized men, some with oversized egos. And I felt totally at home. Whatever was coming my way, I felt I had the skill and experience to handle it. Live TV, on-air interviews, press, booking, commentary, advertising, syndication ideas, and contracts. I felt more than adequate handling them all. My 13 years in the business so far were wide-ranging and diverse, and in my new company, I was never as happy to have such a broad range of experience under my brand new brown leather belt. I could see I wasn't starting over totally new, as there were some familiar faces working for Crockett that had passed through Mid-South more than once. When I first saw Marty Lund a few years earlier, he was working as a preliminary wrestler in Mid-South. I knew right away he was going to be good, and way better than good, if he could find the right persona to bring in front of the TV cameras. Even as a rookie, he never looked bad nor lost in the ring. He also carried himself as an old school guy, which doesn't just mean he knew how to work in and out of a hammerlock, although he certainly did know that. What impressed me was that he also knew the value of his job, that he was there to learn, not to be late or lay on his ass. If Marty was ever told to fix something, he never had to be told twice. He'd get it right then and there. He got it right then and there. He had the personality of a gentleman outside the ring, but the look of a classic heel inside of it. Becoming Arn Anderson worked perfectly for him. Marty was now a part of, and surrounded by, the hottest wrestlers in the company. I saw the four horsemen as I walked on by, and I could tell immediately that these guys were as tight off screen as they were on it. They loved every single facet of the rock star lifestyle, none more than their bleached blonde heavyweight champion, Ric Flair. Flair had come to work for Watts several times, even though Watts operated outside the National Wrestling Alliance, the body promoters that sanctioned all of the NWA World Heavyweight Champions matches. Watts convinced the powers that be that having him book Flair from time to time lessened the NWA's likelihood of an antitrust lawsuit. After all, how could they be a monopoly if Watts was promoting their champion? When the champ came to town, it was my job to tag along and make sure the Nature Boy got everything he needed. That more often than not meant bar time. Serious bar time. I was a willing accomplice in many long nights and near scrapes when Flair was in town. He was a machine who had a non-stop engine for drinking, womanizing, traveling, overspending, and wrestling. As I walked by, the Nate and I shared a smile and a knowing nod. He had already put out the good word about me and what I could do for the boys on commentary. Jim, Crockett said as he approached me from his office, you're going to be play-by-play, and Bob here is going to be the color. Bob was Bob Caudle, a longtime wrestling announcer for the Crockett's, who also had held several other TV jobs, including weatherman, show host, and late-night news anchor. Bob Caudle was the true voice of Mid-Atlantic wrestling for the Crockett family. An impeccably dressed man who wore thick glasses, Bob shook my hand and smiled kindly. Crockett continued, Jim, you'll start each segment and Bob will join in where a little color is appropriate. We both nodded in agreement and Crockett left us to see the other matters. I was concerned how Bob might see me coming in and taking over the play-by-play end of things. What Crockett wanted was for Bob to stand aside and let me take the lead, a position that Bob had held with Crockett for years. Bob, I said, I don't have any agendas about wanting to lead off the segments. Oh, Jim, it's okay, he replied. That's what they want. It's no problem at all. What a class act, which at times can be a rarity in this business. I don't know if Bob knew a German suplex from a continent suplex, but that wasn't his forte. He was a storyteller who understood human nature, human emotion, and good versus evil, and he knew how to fit right in with his broadcast partner and represent a fan's perspective without becoming a one-dimensional miliquitous good guy cheerleader. As I got to know Bob, it quickly became clear that in a business that's always had a prominent underbelly, Bob stood head and shoulders above 99% of everyone I ever met in wrestling thus far. I watched how he interacted with others and took mental notes. Even though I had been in the business for well over a decade at this point, I never stopped watching and learning. Bob and I were placed on the B shows for Crockett, with the lead team of Tony Schiavone and David Crockett announcing for a worldwide wrestling show that aired first in the local markets. It was my goal from the second I entered that first day in Richmond Coliseum that I would eventually make the lead announce team on TBS. The Superstation was a national star maker, and in my world, it was that national stage where the best announcers plied their trade. Jim, Crockett said as he whizzed past again, we're going out for some drinks tonight, if you're interested. I didn't have to be asked twice. I was a newly single guy in a new job in a new city. Who's tagging along? I asked. Me, you, and Dusty, he replied. Yes, sir, I said. Me, the boss, and the booker. I knew this was a great opportunity to show them both just how professional, trustworthy, and mature I was. This is going to be interesting, isn't it? We'll see how this goes for him. About 6 hours later, Dusty Rhodes and I were drunkenly standing in Jim Crockett's driveway ready to do battle. Crockett was watching closely as the American Dream and I squared off. Our breath smelled of liquor and our steps toward each other were more than a little wobbly. This was the time and place for two specimens like myself and Dusty Rhodes to prove who the better man was. And we were going to do it using a time-honored American tradition. You sure you want this, baby? Dusty asked through his familiar lisp. I am not going to try to pretend to do Dusty's voice. I know what it sounds like. I'm not going to try to mimic it. You bet your ass I do, I replied. All right, man, you asked for it. My first night on the job, and I found myself in the driveway of my new boss at 2 a.m., about to challenge the booker and the company to a game of horse. You both agree to the rules? Crockett asked. He was about the same level of hammered as we were. It's pretty straightforward, Jimmy, Dusty replied as he the basketball with intent. $100 says I'll whoop Jim Ross's Oklahoma ass. I reached for my money like John Wayne reaching for his gun. Except I was pretty drunk and couldn't remember where my wallet was. Dusty pointed to the floor. Thank you, I said as I stooped to reclaim my wallet. How it got there, I have no idea. 100? I asked. 100 is what I heard, Crockett replied. His wife was at the top window of their home, anxiously looking down on three drunk fools making noise in their driveway. Watch this guy, Dusty said to Crockett about me. These Elkies are born cheaters. Dream bounced the ball in my direction. My hands were too drunk to protect my face, and it took me a minute to realize I'd just been hit in the nose with it. Oh, Spalding, right in the kisser, Crockett said, as he and Dusty creased over with laughter. I was having a hard time focusing on Crockett's house, never mind the basketball hoop attached to it. In normal circumstances, I would have been competitive in a high-stakes game like horse, but on this night, my motor functions were a little impaired. The only thing that gave me hope was watching Dusty struggle just as much as I was. For all his trash talking and court psychology, Dream was as shit-faced as me. It was like if the NBA only recruited chubby Caucasian players, then this was Game 7. Both Dusty and I took roughly 1,000 shots each other. We took 1,000 shots each before we finally made the 5. Horse count. We were out there so long that neither of us even noticed Crockett going to bed and turning off the lights on his driveway. Dusty and I were Texas versus Oklahoma, mano a mano, stocky commentator versus stocky wrestler. We were impaired, having fun, talking trash, and full of hope. Between the failed shots and the heavy laps, we talked wrestling, the future. We knew how lucky we were to be on the verge of something new and exciting. The $100 bill passed hands a few times over the course of the night, but what stayed put was the sense that we understood each other. Vince ain't going to give up that easy, Dusty said as we finally walked away from Crockett's house. He had the basketball under his arm and my $100 in his pocket. I know, I replied. The sale of UWF to Crockett Promotions was either going to catch the fire or flame out. I had a feeling we were going to find out quickly as to which it was going to be. So how badly are you going to tell people that I beat you? Dusty asked as we shared the last beer on our walk back toward his Mercedes. I'll tell them you whooped my ass, I replied. Smart. I'm not dumb enough to beat the booker. Really smart. Talking like two good old friends, aren't they? Even if they were drunk off their ass, they're still talking like friends. Chapter 24. Let the Games Begin. 1987. I rented a condo in Dallas that had a communal pool, and that communal pool was frequented by ladies, which meant I was always feeling communal for some reason. I was making good money, roughly the same 6 figures I was making with Bill, and working a much lighter schedule. I was in the sun, meeting new people, enjoying my Crown Royal and the occasional herb, while hoping a permanent place would present itself for me on TBS. As I lay poolside with the sun beating down on me, I couldn't get a single sentence out of my head. Oh, you're renting? I thought you were one of the smart guys in this business, Jim. Jimmy Crockett, my new boss, had made the passing comment a few days before and it started to bother me. Did he think I wasn't committed enough to buy a house in Dallas because I didn't have faith in his company? Did he think I wasn't smart enough to see the benefit of buying a house? Did he think I couldn't afford it? Whatever it was, my ego and paranoia began to double-team me. Perception was truly reality in the wrestling business. That's why the parking lot outside Crockett's new Dallas office looked like a Cadillac dealership. Everyone on top of the organization was living the life, none more so than Crockett himself. Limos, fur coats, Rolex watches. The company even had even had two private planes. One an older 14-seat Gulfstream, the Jabroni jet that sounded creaky in flight, and the other a 10-seat Falcon that Crockett called Stardust after Booker Dusty Rhodes. I had no jet, no Rolex, no limo, and no house. Exactly 1 week later, I still had no jet, no Rolex, and no limo, but I was moving into my new house. A house I didn't need and didn't want. Perception was everything, and I wasn't going to let it be said that Jim Ross wasn't smart or dedicated, even if it meant spending every last penny I had. For two companies whose public faces were not to view the other as competition, Jim Crockett Promotions and WWF sure didn't act like it. Both sides traded swift and damaging blows to their openers, with McMahon very much coming out on top. As Crockett got ready for our company's first pay-per-view, Vince McMahon prodded his reply from his Connecticut offices. Crockett's Starrcade had been the lone Thanksgiving night wrestling show since its 1983 debut, but everything was changing in the wrestling business, and old traditions didn't mean anything to the man who was running WWF. Starrcade was about to get head-to-head company. Cable companies at first saw an opportunity to market a wrestling doubleheader. Starrcade from Crockett and a new concept called Survivor Series from McMahon. But Vince, of course, had other ideas. The WWF head honcho was coming off the incredible success of WrestleMania 3 with Hogan defeating Andre, so he had the clout to tell cable providers that they would have to choose between offering Survivor Series or Starrcade. However, any company that chose Starrcade over Survivor Series will not be able to carry next year's WrestleMania 4. Now, let's talk about that for a second before we go on with this. This was Vince McMahon being a cold-blooded, not so good team player in the wrestling business. He was very much under the perception of wanting to go national, but the problem was he couldn't do it right off the bat. When he bought the company off from his father in 1982, I believe it was, he just could not start off and try to go national right off the bat. He had to do certain things, particularly be very popular with the outside crowd, in order for him to do so. And if you guys recall correctly, we did talk about in the last part, one of the last two parts of Slobberknocker, we did talk about the event known as Black Saturday. That was Vince McMahon's one of Vince McMahon's attempts to try to go national, but it didn't work. He tried to go in some other areas in the national sense outside of New York, but it just didn't work because this was a show that had NWA wrestling, and now it was having WWF wrestling, and the crowds then did not like it, so they basically said, "We want NWA wrestling," um, which is what they ultimately got back. It just didn't work out for McMahon. Now in 1987, by the time 1987 rolled around, at this point, he was gained success because he did WrestleMania 1, which was in 1985, and that grew very successful. So that obviously meant he was going to do a WrestleMania 2. And to try to top the first one, he tried to do he basically tried to do three separate shows in one night. He did one in New York City, which was in Madison Square Garden. I think he did one in Rosemont, Illinois, if I'm not mistaken, and he did one in Uniondale, New Jersey. Those were, I believe, the three cities that he was in for WrestleMania 2. That one probably was a hit or miss compared to the first one, but, it was still successful enough that he did WrestleMania 3. And because of the rivalry between Hogan and Andre after WrestleMania 3, which was very popular at the time, by the way, he then started doing this big event in 1987, which was Survivor Series. And the main match going into that was basically Team Hogan versus Team Andre. In a 4-on-4 Survivor Series match, I believe. This was before they started doing the 5-man, the 5-on-5 Survivor Series matches. Back then, they were 4-on-4. That's how it was back then. And also, up until a particular point in the 90s, Survivor Series was held on the Thursday. It was I don't exactly remember which day it was exactly, but Survivor Series for a time up until the mid 90s, I think it was. It would take place not on the usual Sunday, but it would take place uh, on Thanksgiving week to make it like a Thanksgiving tradition. But then they would put it on Sunday after some number of years, and that's that. Now in this situation, McMahon, who is not much of a team player in wrestling, he believes he was so much better than everybody else, even if there were times when the other competition had their moments to where it seemed like they could actually kick his ass in many different ways than one. Think about it. Vince McMahon has always thought highly of himself in any way, shape, or form, to the point where his ego was so big that he honestly could do something like this. He really would do something like this. And we're going to talk about the aftermath of what Vince did here in a moment. But you also got to think about the times where he was met with good competition that it seemed like, okay, something could possibly happen. We've seen it twice now. We've seen it with WCW during the Monday Night War because WWE was at its lowest and WCW was at its highest for 84 weeks before WWE finally beat them in the ratings. And then WCW did some stupid shit that would ultimately would cause them to close down shop in March of 2001. Then shortly after that, in the next year, you had NWA TNA, which would then become TNA, then Impact Wrestling, then back to TNA throughout its history. And for a time, TNA was actually doing pretty good for itself as well. Not as good as WCW, I would say, but still good enough that it was gaining traction to the point to where people were talking about TNA, even on WWE's one show titled Fight This, which had Todd Grisham as the host. Yes, I remember that, even though I didn't watch it back then, but I do remember this because there's a YouTube video talking about which basically shows Todd Grisham hating on TNA. Likely because he kind of had to, because he was paid by the Vince McMahon, and he was in WWE, so to try to talk nice about a competition, generally isn't something Vince McMahon likes you to do, for the most, up until the last few years of his time in the creative control in WWE. Up until the last few years of him being able to have creative control in WWE, would he start to allow other companies being mentioned by name instead of just acting like this guy that got his name elsewhere, like in TNA, comes to WWE and they can't talk about it. Yeah. So, outside of that, you also had AEW outside of TNA. And I say had because AEW was very much like WCW. It like with the Monday Night Wars. Because AEW was starting to get very popular as the time went on for some time. But then as soon as, and I cannot make this up, as soon as Cody Rhodes leaves the company, and then joins WWE about a year or two late, the next 1 or 2 years, AEW, if you notice, has now gotten to the point to where even its own fan base are not liking it whatsoever. It's all because some dude with the last name of Khan, who is the son of Nick Khan, who owns the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's because this dude who won't shut his fucking mouth, and he just puts his foot in his mouth whenever he speaks or tries to show something. He just puts his own foot in his mouth. And now it's at this point where I'm honestly believing that within the next 5 years, AEW's doors are going to close. And ain't nobody going to. It's like what a friend of mine said. Nick Khan will have to at some point tell his son, look him dead in the eyes and tell him, listen, I cannot keep on letting you pay for this anymore. This has cost me so much money, I am no longer willing to finance any of this. You are on your own. And because of how how the sales have been going, whether they've been going up and down, like up or like going down or like in the middle, and not going up a little bit, but still mainly going down or whatever. Even if if the ticket sales go down, it's going to show that Tony has lost his step completely. The only reason why I'm starting to think the only reason why that company was so successful was because of Cody Rhodes. Because ever since then, Tony Khan's been running it to the ground. It's crazy. Crazy how a guy who, yeah, it's literally like the Monday Night Wars all over again. Although the main shows are happening on different days of the week, but it's still going to where AEW is doing so many different bad things to themselves that I would not be surprised if their doors close within 5 years from now. I would say 5 months, but I'm being a bit generous with them. I swear to God, if it actually closes down in 5 months, I can't believe I accidentally called it in a way. That's gonna be crazy. But anyway, we're moving on. I felt it was a bluff. We're going back to the story now. I felt it was a bluff because there was no way Vince was going to stop his baby, WrestleMania, from being carried by every single company that could air it. His national expansion had not yet paid off to the point that WWF could afford to sacrifice the cash flow that a widely aired Mania could bring. Of course, the cable companies didn't know if Vince had the balls to stick to his guns or not, so of the dozens who had committed to airing Starrcade, only five actually did, and the loss of planned revenue crippled Crockett out of the gate. Also didn't help that we were main eventing with Ric Flair versus Ronnie Garvin, but with Flair in the unusual role of challenger, Garvin had won the belt from Flair a couple months before, which I thought was a mistake, and not because of Garvin's ability, as he was a hell of a worker, but because Ronnie wasn't terribly charismatic and didn't project a lot of personality in interviews. And the way the run up to the match was booked did Garvin no favors either. Crockett announced that Garvin would have a 45-day period of no-title defenses to allow him time to prepare for the Starrcade cage match against Flair. Garvin, who won the title with zero build-up beforehand, needed to be seen defending the belt to give him credibility as champion. Instead, it looked like he was getting protection from the promotion. To make matters worse, not only was Vince hobbling Starrcade, but Crockett's own booking was doing a good hatchet job on the event as well. When Flair pinned Garvin to regain the belt on November 26, 1987, at Starrcade, the Chicago crowd roared its approval, even though Rick was the heel. If you notice, that happens a lot in wrestling. That actually happens a good amount of times in wrestling, when the company wants you to cheer for this good guy, but they really cheer for the villain. It happens so often in wrestling that it's actually crazy. But it goes to show how well the booking was for the fan favorite character compared to the heel. Because the heel was putting in a lot of the work, in this situation, the heel was putting in a lot of the work, while the good guy was getting protected. Pretty much. He really was, pretty much. I mean, if you're not, of course they could say, well, he could still wrestle a match, you just can't defend the belt. That kind of defeats the whole purpose of a fighting champion, okay? I mean, yeah, he is technically a fighting champion, but he's not a fighting champion, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Anyway, it only got worse 2 months later when Crockett attempted his second pay-per-view, the Bunkhouse Stampede. This time, McMahon partnered with USA Network, the home of WWF's primetime wrestling show, to air a free special called Royal Rumble. Again, on the same day. That move hurt not only Crockett financially, but the cable companies as well. Those companies missed out on their shot at pay-per-view revenue due to a free special that netted them nothing. The battle spread to the venues too. Vince dispatched Ed Cohen, who was a rock star in the arena management world, to negotiate a prime tenant clause in all WWF contracts with the buildings. This meant no other wrestling company could use those venues for 60 days before and after WWF was booked in them. This, of course, put huge strategic pressure on Crockett. It made the touring aspect of his promotion way more difficult than it should have been. If he could find the right venue, then he found it hard to get the right dates. If he nailed down the right dates, he'd find it hard to find a venue that hadn't already signed an agreement with Vince. Cohen even tried to sell Louisiana by going to see the Athletics Commission appointed by the governor there, Edwin Edwards. Now, I had personal knowledge of just how Edwards in Louisiana operated, as I visited him a couple of times when I worked for Watson McGirt. The state of Louisiana, through the State Athletic Commission, only sanctioned one pro boxing license and one pro wrestling license per year. In the early days, I was sent to Edwards' office with an envelope to make sure the wrestling license wasn't an issue. I was around a business where charisma paid the bills, but Edwin Edwards was by far the most charismatic man I'd ever met at that point in my life. "I'm a little concerned for you coming down here with cash," Edwards said to me once. "Tell your people I'll take a check from now on." He was concerned for me. Not himself, but me. Edwards considered himself untouchable and above any move to highlight just how corrupt he was. But me? Well, I might get caught. So I wasn't surprised when I heard that Ed Cohen was literally laughed out of his meeting with the Louisiana Athletic Commission. Apparently they found it hilarious that McMahon sent a Jew to see them instead of his southern wife, Linda. Wow, okay. Vince was winning street fight battles all over the U.S., but Louisiana was a tougher nut to crack. So the WWF boss put his focus back on pay-per-view. WrestleMania 4, WWF's biggest show of the year, came shortly after, on March 28, 1988, live on pay-per-view. And lo and behold, Crockett and Dusty decided that would also be the perfect day to run a free special of their own on TBS called Clash of the Champions. They also decided that this would be my first TBS primetime event to commentate on. I knew this provided me an opportunity to help launch my broadcasting career on a national level. Dusty and Jimmy Crockett taught me to work with Tony Schiavone, which was a bold move considering that we both were play-by-play guys, but our duo worked nicely. Tony and I had chemistry that couldn't be artificially produced, which I felt was always the key to any broadcast team. It was also the first time I'd worked in the famous sports cathedral known as the Greensboro Coliseum. Going live in prime time on free nationwide TV was a huge rush. It felt like one of the highlights of my career so far. As I stood there looking around, I knew I had come a long way from the KTBS TV studio in Shreveport. The size, the scope, the majesty of it all made me think I'd made the right decision in coming to Dallas. Unfortunately, my UWF brothers weren't faring nearly as well. They were booked to look inferior to their Crockett NWA counterparts. The UWF belts were made to look meaningless, and soon after wrestler began jumping ship to Vince's WWF while looking for work elsewhere. The Clash of the Champions card was stacked with the main event pitting world champion Ric Flair against Sting, the face-painted powerhouse who was the hottest young star Crockett had. The match went 45 minutes with the only downside of the match being the finish. 3 judges sat at ringside who would score the match and determine a winner if it went the full 45-minute time limit. When it ended, only one judge voted for Flair, one for Sting, and the third ruled it a draw. Even when we had Vince on the ropes, we ended up punching ourselves in the balls with flawed creative. I was happy with my debut on Crockett's national TV show, though. I knew I could do better, but thought I did enough to be kept in contention. Even the flat finish couldn't negate the Clash's ratings success or change the fact that we had siphoned millions of dollars from WWF's biggest show. At that point, the cable companies did step in because these free event versus pay-per-view showdowns were costing them big, no matter which wrestling promotion won the day. Vince turned his stance around and used his influence to point out just how much Crockett's free show had cost not only him, but the cable carriers too. Turner suddenly had a field calls from his friends in the cable TV business about how TBS running free shows was hurting their bottom line. To Vince, wrestling was everything. To Ted, it was just another thing. That simple fact made me kind of nervous for who might win out this battle in the end. There were no WWF tactics to contend with when we held our next pay-per-view, the Great American Bash, but a combination of those costly pay-per-view battles and some poor business decisions by Crockett had already put the company in a dire financial situation. That dire situation was only exacerbated by the fact that Crockett's own accountant, a longtime family friend, didn't report the promotion's $5 million hole for nearly a full year after it appeared, or so we were told. All the talk of money owed and sudden cutbacks made me nervous. I saw in Crockett what I had seen in Cowboy before him. There was a particular look a man got when he was racking up debt, losing a fight, and looking for a way to move on. Crockett's company had become like a men's club with hundred mile journeys that used to take place in packed cars, now taking place in the company jets. The West Coast loops were purposefully based out of Las Vegas, where Stardust could fly the boys to a show and then back to Sin City to party all night, only to reappear again over and over, show after show. Vegas became the hub of the West Coast. I was becoming more and more curious as to the company's future, even though I got paid according to my contract. My money was delayed a few times, but they always told me about it ahead of time. Still, I was preparing myself financially and psychologically to take a pay reduction. A blind man could see that Crockett Promotions just couldn't continue as it was. Within months, rumors quickly started floating that TBS was looking to either bail out Crockett or buy the promotion outright. The wars with Vince, coupled with the out of control spending and some curious booking decisions, were destroying the company before it really found its national feet. Taking a drink. Chapter 25. Returning Home, 1988. I hadn't been home in a while, but I knew what was going on, or at least I knew one side of what was going on. My father and I hadn't been on the best of terms since he and my mom separated. I thought I could give it a shot at maybe getting them back together. No one asked me to, but I decided to give it a try anyway. I met my dad in a Greasy Spoon restaurant in Stillwell, Oklahoma, the strawberry capital of the world. He was living there now, and seeing another woman in the area. As per usual in our relationship, we made small talk and avoided anything too deep or meaningful as we ate. I paid for lunch. I wanted to. I wanted to show my old man that I had moved on from my failures and had money in my pocket. I wanted him to see that my decision to leave and run away with the circus was paying off. At least for now. My dad and I both finished our meal without me saying what was really on my mind. That's how we had separate cars and I was heading back to Dallas, him back to his new home. He waited for me outside the front door as I put on my jacket and followed him out. Well, it was good to see you, he said. You too, I replied. You take care, son. There was a moment between us where he left me enough time to say what was obviously on my mind, but I couldn't even form the words properly. Words that I had been rehearsing in my car the whole ride there. He nodded and turned to leave. How could you do it? I blurted out. He stopped. There was a couple of people walking by. He waited for them to pass before replying, but I jumped back in before he could. My heart was racing now, adrenaline flowing. How could you do it to Mom? There are two sides to every story, son, he said. Now I'm sorry that things ended up the way they did between me and your mother, but what? I interrupted. What the hell was worth this? I felt nervous at even cussing in his company. You don't know all the facts, he calmly said. Like hell I don't, I shouted. You he took he took a step toward me. People were starting to notice our conversation. Listen, son, you need to know that if you keep talking to me the way you're talking, then there'll be consequences to those words. Son or not, you've no place sticking your nose in. You understand me? He waited for my reply. There wasn't anything I could say. He was right. Who the fuck was I to lecture anyone on relationships? I'd only heard my mother's side of things, and in a town as small as ours, she was embarrassed by my father's actions. It broke my heart to think of her putting up with the small town's humiliation every day. You got anything else you want to say to me now? My father asked. I shook my head. I was still pissed at him, but what was there left to say? He hugged me. Let's leave it there then, he said as he turned and walked for his pickup truck. He headed home to a house he obviously wanted to be in with a lady he loved, and I headed back to the house I didn't want, alone. Chapter 26 Last Days of Crockett, 1988. Don't worry, they won't replace you as an announcer, Cowboy said over the phone. He was out of the business, but people like Watts never truly stopped taking a keen interest in what's happening. What makes you so sure? I asked as I stood in the house I didn't want and couldn't afford without a monthly check. They do TV, he replied. If Turner buys, he's doing it because he sees it as a TV product, and they're not going to find anyone they like better than you. I'm not sure about. They're not going to want to disrupt operations, he said, interrupting me. You've already established yourself. You should probably feel as secure as anyone there. Coming from someone who understood wrestling and television as well as anyone ever had, that made me feel a lot better. And as usual, he was right. And Jim, you're going to love Atlanta. It's like the New York of the South. Bill had lived there while working for Georgia Championship Wrestling in the early 70s. I could hear in his voice that he was missing the hustle of the business a little. New York of the South, huh? I said. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah come to life. Now that I could handle. While a lot of the Turner broadcasting suits looked down their noses at wrestling, Ted Turner himself liked it and saw it as the programming that had helped build his UHF Channel 17 in Atlanta in a cable superstation TBS. It had been on the network since the 60s. TBS had always been built on the Atlanta Braves, the Andy Griffith Show, the MGM Movie Library, and wrestling. Ted also liked the notion of competing with Vince McMahon. Plus, the show's always got good ratings, and wrestling provided 3 hours of first-run programming each weekend. So as Crockett was going under, I was confident that wrestling would remain on TBS in some form or fashion. But I didn't know what that form would be, or if it had room for me, so I quietly started exploring other options. I made some inroads with Atlanta radio stations at the Atlanta Falcons. I was getting ready to move again. For 18 months, my Atlanta experience had consisted of the drives between the airport, the hotel, and the TBS studios where we taped our weekly programs. After hearing Watts' assessment of the place, I was even more excited to get out of the house. I bought and just move. Any more word on my 5%? I asked Watts before he hung up. Truth was, I already knew the answer. Jim Barnett, the flamboyant former wrestler turned famed promoter, had already given me the dirt. Jimsy loved to gossip about what was going on in the business. Well, Cowboy said, I didn't get my $4 million, so you won't get your 5% either. So what will I get? I asked. It took me several months. It took me several months to get my answer. I would receive a $10,000 check from Bill, but he insisted that I fly from Dallas to his hometown in Tulsa to buy him a high-dollar dinner to get the money. So from the industry-changing deal I initiated, where I got a fraction of what I thought I would, I bought Cowboy a great meal and the rest to finish financing divorce number 2. Who was I to lecture my father on relationships indeed? And surprisingly, that is actually it. We actually got through it pretty quickly. So now we are on to part 5. We are now on to part 5. WCW, 1988 to 1993. This chapter consists of chapters 27 all the way up to chapter 40. We're not going to read that tonight. We'll read that. We'll probably split this one in half as well. Depends on what goes on for that night when we do this in questions. But in any case, that was Slobberknocker, My Life in Wrestling, part 5, I think it was. It's part 4 or 5. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. And until next time, this is Forrest Walpole signing off.